Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales. This comparatively young library sits on one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I am coming to you from Gadigal land. I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us this morning. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks, and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the State Library of New South Wales. And I would like to give you all a very special welcome to this, the last Scholar Talk for our 2023 season. As always, if you have any questions from our speaker today, you can pop those into the chat feature in Zoom, and I will come to those at the end of today's presentation. Today we are joined by Dr. Alexandra Dellios. She's a lecturer at the Australian National University and was, of course, our C.H. Curry Fellow of 2022. She's already been disseminating her research, so some of you may have had a little bit of a taster of what we're going to hear today. And her rich research on Greek Australian women and migrant welfare services here in Australia and some of the really poignant experiences of those women. Thanks so much, Alexandra.
Thank you, Rachel. I too want to acknowledge the First Nations peoples on whose lands I'm presenting from here in Meanjin, the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Much of this research was conducted on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Kulin Nation. So this research, as Rachel has outlined, concerns Greek Australian welfare workers and advocates who were active in the 60s and right up until the late 1990s. The perspective of ethnic minority women are pivotal to understanding the history of multiculturalism as an access and equity framework in New South Wales and in Australia more broadly. Today I'm going to be drawing on some of the oral histories I conducted with welfare advocates and migrant background women in Sydney, in combination with records I consulted over 2022 at the State Library of New South Wales. So the issues these women tackled were obviously complex and in many ways remain issues, nearly 50 years since the introduction of a national multicultural policy and various state multicultural bodies, including translation and language learning in the workplace and in welfare health systems, the availability of culturally appropriate and accessible childcare services, the communication of workplace safety, and work entitlements to culturally and linguistically diverse peoples, and concerns around political participation and the representation of so-called cold people and working class women more broadly in Australia. Obviously, the historical study of social movements that emerged in the 60s and 70s, women's lib, Indigenous sovereignty and workers' rights. Some of these histories have ignored migrant and ethnic minority voices in Australia, especially working migrant women and their experiences. Looking to the late 60s and 70s, however, we can see that migrant rights activists, as well as social welfare workers, most of them women, and ethnic community organisations were instrumental in building early models of what we now call multiculturalism, or at least pushing systems of governance to recognise the multi-ethnic nature of the population and to offer more targeted services. So their version of multiculturalism was informed by an inter-ethnic social justice agenda that engaged with the access and equity debates of the era and the anxieties around industrial decline. The work of this movement in the 70s eventually gained mainstream political responses. Nonetheless, the work of migrant rights advocates and welfare advocates among them had immediate social impacts on their communities on the ground. However, much of this on-the-ground work has been mostly emitted from more top-down assessments of the history of multiculturalism in Australia. Therefore, this project was about capturing those voices, women who worked at the front lines of welfare and service provision for their communities. Many of them began in volunteer roles and transitioned into more formally trained roles as social welfare workers, welfare rights officers, solicitors, and health interpreters. On the screen here, I've got a list of the research questions that I had in the back of my mind throughout the time I was at the State Library. I won't go through all of these, but these are some of the key collections I found particularly useful at the State Library in the course of conducting this research, including most obviously the New South Wales Ethnic Community Council manuscripts, which was really useful in tracing, I guess, the development of the Ethnic Communities Council after the end of the Good Neighbour Council in 1974. It contained a wealth of kind of community analysis reports of migrant needs and services in particular suburbs of Sydney. The New South Wales Ethnic Affairs Commission project, the Oral History Project, which is always been useful, and I'm sure some of you in the audience today have consulted this Oral History Project yourself. A lot of independent researchers commissioned reports for state bodies. I'm thinking of work done by the Women's Electoral Lobby, notes in particular from the New South Wales Migrant Women's Working Group. Today I'm going to talk a bit more later on about the transcripts of proceedings from the Commission of Enquiry into Poverty, known as the Henderson Inquiry, which were incredibly useful. And of course, the new Greek Australian Archive, which is an oral history archive, a collection of oral histories with members of the Greek-speaking community in Sydney that is still growing and still being conducted, and other main collection items, including reports by key sociologists, looking at immigrant women in blue-collar work, compensation and injury within industry, as well as Dorothy Buckland Fuller's presented papers and reports. So that is a snapshot. This is just a list of oral histories I did manage to conduct over 2022 while at the library. So Eleni, Yota, Violet, Frida, Poppy, Athena, and Angela, who were very generous with their time, and were all incredibly active in the debates around welfare, access, and equity in or from the late 1970s, right up until today. Actually, many of them are still working. It proved quite time-consuming, as any oral history project is, to actually find the network of people relevant to the study and those who were willing to speak with me. Despite distributing, calls for participants, the most effective way of finding people actually just proved to be snowballing, word of mouth, being connected through personal connections. So cold calls didn't really work. So it was mostly through individual connections and introductions that I managed to find these women who were generous enough to sit down and do some oral histories with me. And eventually, and hopefully, they will be part of the Greek Australian Archive at the library. Just backtracking for a moment, going back to those 4 key questions I had at the beginning of my research project, I thought I'd answer them one by one. So question 1 about the perspectives that Greek Australian women who worked at the front lines of migrant welfare and service provision can provide to early histories of multiculturalism or new histories of multiculturalism, if you will. Obviously, it's been difficult to access these voices in the existing archive, and this is where oral histories and community networks became especially important. Some reports, especially from the 1980s, during which concern about the working conditions facing non-English speaking migrant women in factory settings seemed to kind of breach that public-private divide. Many of these reports were published from the late 70s and into the 80s. These can provide arresting testimony from migrant women themselves, and sometimes the migrant advocates who fought for their rights in the workplace. My assumption was that Greek-speaking women worked in many of the thankless tasks from within many of these male-dominated ethnic community groups, and they did, but it wasn't always as simple as this. Anecdotal evidence also indicates that there was a generational shift in attitudes, perhaps a more outward-looking aspirationalism within the Greek-speaking communities of Sydney, and from first generation to second or even 1.5 generation, that university-educated women who started entering the field of welfare from the late 70s and into the 80s, who were embracing both a new government funding regime, particularly around access to grants and aid for ethnic welfare communities. They also embraced what they called ethnic lobbying in a state multicultural framework, and in the context as well, and of course, of a professionalizing welfare sector from the 1970s. Early attention to migrant women's issues, particularly working class issues, was bolstered more initially by radical trade unions and the far left than it was by women's liberation groups. Groups like the Women's Electoral Lobby and the Women's Employment Action Centre did make brief references to ethnic women and their issues. Some of it can, from our current standing, come across as a bit condescending. It's certainly very Anglo-centric and sometimes very classist. Assistance, especially in the early 1970s, is extended not in the spirit of collaboration or a mutual understanding of ethnic difference, but sometimes in a patronizing effort to educate non-English speaking background women, which might be a hangover of an assimilationist discourse, but also is deeply rooted in hierarchical and neo-colonial systems of governance. And this attitude and its structural reality is obviously not confined to ethnic or ethnicized women. And the attitude can also emanate from Greek-speaking women towards other differently classed ethnic women. And some of Dorothy Buckland Fuller's comments in particular on Greek women she assisted at the Marrickville Baby Health Clinic can fall into this category. And of course, inclusion, exclusion, and some of the racist institutions upheld by mainstream white feminism has been discussed and identified by First Nations women, and it is an ongoing struggle in settler colonial Australia in which we're all implicated. So I was aware of that while I was going through some of these reports. From the other perspective, though, the perspective of migrant rights movements, that is migrant rights, migrant peoples themselves, the elevated position of Australian-born or educated Greeks within official bodies obviously contributed to their cultural capital, but did the arguments around working conditions and welfare rights, although they became more dire during the decline in manufacturing by the 80s, did this dissipate because of these people's kind of conditional integration into reigning and generally Anglophone systems of governance? And that's a pretty big question that I'm still grappling with. Some activists within the migrant rights movement have laid this charge against the more willing ethnic professionals and lobbyists who signed up to be a part of the new bureaucracy that grew out of state multiculturalism from the late 70s. Others have framed it in terms of their co-option and a deliberate attempt by the mainstream Anglo elite to cut off the head of the migrant rights movement by integrating its leaders into newly created leadership positions in government portfolios or government-funded multicultural research bodies. This, however, is perhaps a more cynical reading of the situation. Turning, though, specifically to the issues of migrant women and how they fared in this evolving multicultural bureaucracy, there were obviously serious issues facing working migrant women, particularly those in the industrial sector, which were, as I indicated, eventually recognised by government agencies and by bodies like the New South Wales Ethnic Affairs Commission, pushed along by other groups like the New South Wales Ethnic Communities Council, which contained, from what I understand, a subcommittee of the New South Wales Migrant Women's Working Group in the 1980s. And this particular group featured some very familiar names, including Franca Arena, Vivi Koutsounaris, who I showed on a previous slide, and Stella Nord. The notes from their meetings indicate that while they used the Ethnic Affairs the Ethnic Affairs Commission as a meeting place, they were an independent lobby group with close ties to the Western Suburbs Council for Social Development, which was a group that existed just prior to the formation of the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales, as well as ties to the Immigrant Women's Speak Out group, which was first convened in 1982. I note also that they had representatives from prominent trade unions. And they managed to achieve quite a bit in their advocacy work. I note here on this slide in particular some of their frustrations with achieving some of their goals, in which they note that most of the recommendations contained in this particular report has already been articulated, and indeed many of these issues, as I said, kind of remained flashpoints throughout the 70s and the 80s, and in some ways today. So the same issues were brought up again and again, particularly around translation and interpretation as a means to empower communities and migrant women, but also just basic improvements to targeted services and the cultural competency of welfare workers. So the point is, the push to recognise issues facing working migrant women came first from community-initiated research and reports, but that broader state-level legislative and funding changes were quite slow. Their conferences, most notably the 1982 Migrant Women's Conference, made recommendations to trade unions and employers and other bodies about the implication of the, and I quote, dual oppression of both racism and sexism for working migrant women, and the need for targeted services. As well as information programs and support services, as well as active anti-discrimination measures, particularly within the workplace. All of this is not to say that Greek Australian women didn't engage with the broader women's liberation movement, and most of the women I interviewed considered themselves active feminists, especially those who were teenagers during the 1960s and 70s. They questioned prevailing stereotypes as well about the conservatism of Southern European women, and I think that point remains important. It's something that sociologist Gillian Bottomley explored in the 70s and the 80s as well. Capturing some of that sociological detail remains a worthy historiographical task. I am eager to interview as well ethnic women, Southern European women with a migrant background who were involved in many of the industrial disputes of the era. Obviously, just like the oral histories I've done, establishing these kind of networks will take time. And that brings us on to identifying some of the more explicit gaps within the research on multiculturalism in Australia. Obviously, community work and grassroots action. Records are still patchy and kind of ad hoc here. It seems kind of simple enough to state that it's still women, not just working women, that are excluded from the archive. And this is a result of archival traditions that we've inherited. So the gap filling is therefore about locating and contextualizing the role of migrant background women in welfare and service provision for their communities in regards to my project. And that involves both those who worked in a formal and informal capacity. And I can't downplay here the role of unpaid labor and volunteerism, which is again something better accounted for in more informal retellings in new oral histories. Understanding the networks and the connections between these grassroots and ethnicized community groups, as well as new and emerging government administrative bodies, as well as the interactions with the work of departmental social welfare workers and other state-based social services, because of course many welfare measures evolved on a state-by-state basis in Australia. So this requires some mapping work and bringing lots of disparate strands together to see their intersections. Part of this historical work. What is the nature of these evolving and complex relationships between the so-called third sector, which is in itself a very diverse field in Australia, partly subsidised by government, but nonetheless and historically heavily reliant on private donations and volunteers, and how this interacts with newer government agencies at the state level. So we're talking about uneven funding regimes and its impacts. Understanding how that operates is still something that needs to be done. That is the competitive sort of capitalist logic of Australian liberal multiculturalism from the 1980s, which, as many scholars have said, manages to both reify ethnicity and to pit ethnic groups against each other in this kind of battle for funding, whilst concealing the implicated subjectivity of all migrant peoples in this settler colonial system that denies the sovereignty of First Nations peoples. That is a theoretical framework, I think, that should underpin any analysis of the managerial and funding system of Australian multiculturalism. This one's kind of an aside. I got caught up in and am conducting some research on this particular strain with my colleague from UNSW, Dr. Eureka Heinrich, around medical issues and health systems, and in particular the constant attribution of neurosis to migrant workers suffering from work-related injuries and consequent mental health issues. And this was sparked by my listening to the Ethnic Affairs Commission's oral histories I mentioned earlier, those conducted in the 1980s, and how often Southern European migrant women in that collection recall being given the diagnosis of a nervous disorder and prescribed quite heavy tranquilizers instead of having their pain treated or being taken seriously. Which I'm not arguing by any means is something specific to ethnicized women, but is generally something we still talk about in regards to all women and their engagements with health. We did find the issue discussed further in articles in the Medical Journal of Australia and contained in other collections. It's the subject of discussion for seminars and meetings held by the Australian Greek Welfare Society in the 70s and the 80s. So there was definitely a lot of anxiety around this issue of medicating working migrant women. Community voices, at least, and the welfare advocates I came across were concerned about doctors' tendency to overprescribe tranquilizers and antidepressants to Southern European women. Suffering so-called nerves, that is the overburden and stresses of working full-time while maintaining family life to the expectations of their partner's community and within a wider socio-cultural environment that ultimately devalued them and their work. So this kind of anxiety about drug addiction within the Greek community in particular was something I noticed in a few sources, and it's something I think could be a flashpoint to follow up on. Aside from the more broader human impact, both medical, psychological, and emotional, of those legal battles associated with cases of workers' compensation and injured migrant workers, which was a big issue discussed quite a lot in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And that's how I came to interview at least Athena Tariki, who is a lawyer who kind of dealt with the so-called social security scandal of the late 1970s. Question 3, looking at the Greek communities in particular and their involvement in access and equity debates of the era. A lot of these engagements in Sydney, at least, happened through the Ethnic Communities Council and individuals within them. The Atlas League, which was a communist-aligned community group, seems to kind of take a step back at this time, probably due to internal political splits relating to debates in the Communist Party of Australia and their changing orientations to the Soviet Union. In terms of direct service delivery and social welfare assistance, And alongside that activism and lobbying, not a whole bunch was done by the Greek Orthodox communities of New South Wales or their associated churches. But again, various internal splits here makes their role a bit opaque, and the dominance of current personalities have made it quite difficult to tease out some of the different voices from this era. Overall, the Melbourne scene seems to have been more active in the activist and access and equity debates of the era, because they had quite a number of key activists and the support of local ecumenical charities, and of course the concentration of Greeks in Melbourne. Certainly they had more activists. And this kind of leads on to this question about their alliances and where they rest on the political spectrum. From what political position did these women engage in welfare work and in activism for their communities, as well as what did their community work entail? And I guess this is actually two questions. And the second part of this question is whether oral histories were especially valuable, even getting a sense for their client work, their casework. Everyone had examples of the more difficult cases that they encountered over their careers, most of them to do with family counselling, something that necessitated a teamwork approach, the need to engage and navigate multiple organisations and government structures, legal, medical, and to sensitively navigate cultural expectations and attitudes, both Anglo-Australian and from within ethnic communities, different regional and class differences. But to the first half of this question, I found that sometimes many of these women engaged in their work from a professedly non or unpolitical position, and with very personal motivations, very emotional motivations based on their family histories. Though, of course, many were boosted by their own social justice agendas. And this seemed to be the case with Vivi Koutsounadis in particular, a welfare worker trained as a psychologist, although she and many other women did admit being more closely aligned with the ALP and the Labor Party, and many of them were members of the cults that many Greek communities in Sydney are around Whitlam and then Hawke, particularly those who worked and lived in the Marrickville area. In terms of their community work, particularly Vivi, I just wanted to briefly mention childcare services. And obviously these problems are incredibly familiar to us today around access and cost. The issue that they focused on as well was culturally appropriate care, subsidising services and making it available through workplaces, that is through factories in the industrial sector. Obviously, women's lib groups campaigned around this issue, but they did also take some time to reach out to their ethnic minority sisters. The Anglo-centrism, as well as some of the middle-class limitations of some of these kind of proclamation, maybe ignored the reality faced by non-English speaking migrant women, or otherwise relied on stereotypes around the subservient Mediterranean wife from a rural background, to describe their situations. And again, I'm thinking of some of the work of Dorothy Buckland Fuller, who did also grapple with the issue of care, of childcare. Most, but not all, migrant women, but especially Southern European migrant women worked full-time, and childcare while working was central. As well as the provision of after-school care for children over the age of 5. And this was a constant problem, leaving children unattended. Obviously, these centres don't operate corresponding to those usual work hours. So the lack of culturally appropriate, affordable and consistent childcare threw up a lot of issues for migrant women, who obviously also took on labour both inside and outside the home. And as the research indicates, migrant women made up most of the labour force in textile and clothing manufacturing, where they worked quite long hours in sometimes unforgiving factory settings. So in the 70s and the 80s, as I indicated, well-meaning academics and some community organisations published various reports on the condition faced by migrant women workers. The background activity to These somewhat passive depictions, however, is the activist work that these women engaged in to secure better services. And Vivi Koutsounadis' oral history interview in the Greek Australian Archive at the moment relays some of this work and the importance of the establishment of an ethnic childcare development unit based in Marrickville, where the Greek population was quite large. Aligning these developments in the late 70s and the 80s with discussions occurring in women's groups that were slowly opening up to and eventually being led by migrant women is still an important strain in this research, as are other social justice issues that kind of tapped into this one, including issues around workers' compensation, language lessons, translation in the workplace. So these are all kind of tied together. So those were the research questions. In the next part of this paper, I'm going to look in particular at transcripts of the proceedings from the Commission of Enquiry into Poverty, the Henderson Inquiry, which was part of that moment in time. There was a new governmental and institutional awareness of the prevalence of poverty and the need for, across the board, investments in welfare services emanating from the Commonwealth to help vulnerable people. And this extended, obviously, to ethnicised or migrant community cohorts. Not dismissing much of the work done by grassroots community groups to provide welfare services to their communities without government help, and that right up until the post-war era. I think we also have to understand this inquiry in the context of an increasing professionalisation of social welfare work, and you'll see throughout the transcripts these debates about who is qualified to do this type of work. So the Henderson Inquiry, its foundations were actually based in Melbourne. It was built on a smaller scale survey of poverty in Melbourne in the 1960s, which pressured a reluctant federal government to hold an inquiry into poverty, and it was framed as a moral imperative. Liberal PM McMahon agreed as the 1972 election loomed to hold this inquiry. And when Whitlam won, he expanded its scope. As Henderson explained to one columnist in 1972, rather than relying on personal experience, he says, when considering individuals, he turned instead to the trained social worker, whom he argued were more successful in giving an accurate assessment of the landscape of poverty in the country. The implication of this, as historian Fiona Davis has argued, meant that the inquiry showed more patience for those who were, and I quote, trained, rather than personal experience testimonies. That's not to say some of them didn't creep in. If we look at the transcripts, and I have done so whilst consulting them alongside oral histories and community documentation. So the State Library holds 8 volumes of the inquiry transcripts. So these were hearings that were held across the country in rural and urban settings, mostly across 1973. So accordingly, my consultation of the hearing transcript looked at the ways in which existing organisations were addressing migrant needs in their locations. For example, the Marrickville Liaison Community Service, amongst others. Provided here on this slide, I know it's a lot of text, but it's just a snapshot from different hearings. The views of staff here on migrant help and the use of their services, on welfarism, on volunteerism and its necessity of working in migrant and working class communities, as well as the dire need for language training for staff in languages other than English and the need for more staff with other languages. This next slide is just turning to a particular example from the Jewish Welfare Society. This alongside testimony from people like David Cox and Walter Littman, representing the Australian Council of Social Services, as well as hearings from COASIT, the Italian Welfare Society, and from the Department of Immigration were quite useful. But here I'm turning to this particular example with the Jewish Welfare Society, in which Green kind of opens up by arguing that shouldn't we have some inbuilt provision for catering for those who are not of, and I quote, basic English/Australian origin. And then one of the people on the committee argues instead he's looking for more specific information. And Lippmann, I think his responses are quite interesting here, arguing that it's essential there is a recognition that the ethnic group itself is quite capable of and ought to be encouraged to make its own decisions in these matters and be involved in their decision making. And this is quite a timely debate. Most ethnic community organisations, and particularly within the migrant rights movement, are arguing that they should be a part of these debates and are quite frustrated with the kind of paternalism of previous departments of immigration and their attitudes to how to service migrant communities. The question of training of professionals and volunteers also is kind of hinted at in this testimony. There's and I quote, fairly large degree of the use of lay people, according to the Commission. Many groups like the Jewish Welfare Society, but also departments of immigration, are reluctant to use so-called untrained volunteers, but there is a real need for them, as well as a need for training facilities for volunteers and welfare people who aren't fully trained as social workers. So this is part of that conversation in the evolution of practices and limitations in welfare work in Australia, that kind of whether or not untrained personnel and volunteers can engage in individual casework, what group work or community development work should look like, and the question of responsibility for mainstream service providers. And I found this most kind of palpable within the oral histories as well, particularly for those who kind of moved from working with ethnic community organisations and then into state-based agencies, where they saw a real need for mainstream services to change and to service, I guess, the full range of the Australian population. This particular example from the Department of Immigration speaks to the reliance of even longer resident migrants on the department's services. And this is something that also comes up in the oral testimonies right up until the 1980s. Migrants often use the Department of Immigration as their first port of call, even if they'd been here for 30 years. And Walter Lippmann, for his part, cites examples of Baltic migrants, displaced persons who'd been here since the early 1950s, as well as Southern European migrant groups with higher rates of poverty, who would still go to, as their first port of call, the Department of Immigration for help with Centrelink and etc. Those who would feel lost, and I quote, in mainstream community services, not geared to them and their languages. And as Lippmann says, in one quote, it's the failure of community services generally that has thrown onto the Department of Immigration the burden of a vast range of services that cannot be confined to the person recently arrived. It would be premature to interfere with that. However, ideally, community structures, that is mainstream services, need to develop. And you see this argument evolving throughout the 80s and the 90s. The issue of training, and I quote, more ethnics in social welfare work and welfare work more generally, debates about the responsibilities of specific migrant community agencies versus mainstream services, how we integrate cultural competency into the part of normal training of doctors, teachers, and lawyers, a deeper level of cultural change. It's also about challenging the monolingualism and Anglocentrism of existing structures and systems. So that's kind of a strain of the research that also comes up quite a bit in the oral histories. So I wanted to close by talking about how the oral histories complemented much of the archive. and the importance of these oral histories intersecting as a methodology and as a source with that documentary work that I just outlined. Most obviously, oral histories provide access to lived experiences, particularly when talking about some of these conceptual debates around the evolution in social welfare work, about the trained and untrained ethnic welfare worker and what they could achieve in both ethnic community groups as well as state-based health or information agencies, their responsibilities to their communities and accounts of structural deficiencies. This comes across quite a bit in these testimonies, particularly around interpretation services, but also just cultural competency, as I mentioned, which was a constant issue. With these women acting kind of as cultural brokers and navigating different systems on behalf of their clients. Obviously, access to on-the-ground understanding and their response to the needs that they encountered. All of them were involved not just in individual casework, but in community development work, setting up support groups. I'm thinking in particular of the social security scandal and setting up support groups in Marrickville for those victims, or in response to things like the need for community and family counselling. They also offer sometimes explicit and sometimes very difficult to hear discussions of domestic violence within family groups, within ethnic communities and mainstream Australian communities, and subjective experiences that aren't easy to hear about, but also aren't very evident in the official records. They also trace how some issues, as I mentioned, social security access and discrimination, and some events reverberate through time. That is the complex and ambivalent way that some of these events are remembered collectively and individually. I'm thinking of sometimes the shame associated with remembering the social security scandal and how that's kind of negotiated by these individual narrators, who obviously also operate within many different collectivities at the community level, at the professional level, in regards to their assessment of multiculturalism and how it should operate. So all of these things are very useful in trying to unpack how particular events are remembered and what function they have in current memories within certain community groupings. And obviously in addressing so-called gaps in the archive, accounting for the work that these women did, the actual day-to-day work, which isn't always reflected in that documentation I've outlined. Particularly even in some of the activist organisations, ethnic community organisations as well, headed by men. So for accounts of groups and initiatives as well that have very little documentation, those set up by women and volunteers, and in particular I'm flagging the Greek Australian Welfare Workers Association, who don't have any documentation donated to any archive. That is, it's just, I think, held by Angela or Vivi, accounting for the work of some of these groups and initiatives is something we can achieve through these oral histories. Now, I think I've reached 45 minutes, and I'll leave it there and just open it up to everyone for questions if you have them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. I mean, obviously there are some gaps in the archives across a whole range of topics, but I think you've done a pretty good job in being as comprehensive as the collections will allow. One of our first questions coming through is actually about those collections. So you shared with us, you had very clear ideas of what you were looking for when you started your fellowship, and you knew roughly what types of materials you were going to be reviewing. Were there any surprises? Were there any things that you discovered that you thought, I really was not expecting that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It was a win for me to come across the transcripts from the poverty hearings, and I didn't expect to see some of the frank admissions from Anglo-Australian welfare workers at those inquiries as to what was structurally needed to kind of make systems service culturally and linguistically diverse communities better. I guess what was surprising about that is some of these issues just sound so familiar to us today, as in we're still grappling with them. And even within that inquiry as well, other things that kind of were surprising to me was the language that was used around people's right to welfare, which is, I think, distinctly different from the way we talk about welfare today. And there's kind of a fixation on weeding out welfare cheats, whereas the poverty inquiry was kind of all about ensuring that everyone was having access and was achieving their basic needs. So I guess the kind of discursive changes that I was able to quite clearly see within some of that documentation was interesting. I didn't expect to see it so explicitly. And the way we talk about welfare recipients as not just clients, but as, I think the word was, beneficiaries, and the kind of mutual responsibility of communities and government to make sure those needs are being met. I think that was interesting to me. In terms of other surprising finds, I mean, I knew the reports would be there. Some of the, perhaps I hinted at the more kind of condescending attitudes of some women's groups towards ethnic women, particularly working class and rural background women. Perhaps that wasn't surprising.
Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not. But yeah, it's yeah, I hope I've answered that question. I mean, that you could spend years and years in this material and find surprising parts to it as well, I'm sure. Yeah.
The next question might be a little bit more specific, and I don't know if perhaps it's even fair to ask it, but it is an interesting point in that you were talking about, especially that early 70s period, about how women needed a university education to be taken seriously in this space. And the question is around what sort of university education were these women undertaking? So were they specifically doing social work degrees, or perhaps early childcare or early childhood degrees, which you then spoke about later on in your talk? Or were they actually doing all sorts of things? Were there arts degrees? Were there lawyers? How were these women bringing those years at university to this cause?
Yeah, well, actually, everyone I interviewed had very different tertiary education experiences or pathways, if you will. Definitely people like Frida Economides kind of entered the field as a volunteer first for the Good Neighbour Council, and then went on in an administrative role to work for the Department of Immigration in Settlement in Sydney. And she was actually sent by the department to undertake a certificate in Sydney at a specific training college in welfare work. So that was her case. Other women did attend university, as I said. There had been courses, degrees in social welfare work, particularly at the University of Melbourne, since the 1940s. Some of them did achieve qualifications at university in social work. Others started with a BA, actually, a Bachelor of Arts, and then went on to specialise.
Always a good place to start.
Of course. And I'm just trying to remember. Angela was actually educated in Greece and came over with her qualifications already. And obviously Athena Tariki knew from a relatively young age that she wanted to change the system through law, and she studied law at the University of Sydney. So it was definitely a mix of things in terms of their tertiary education and their pathways to social work. Yeah.
Somebody's asked a really super interesting question. So you used a particular word in your presentation which struck out at me as well. So this person's asking, you talked about the idea of a cult around Whitlam and pork in the Greek community. Could you say a little bit more about that and how it might have affected attitudes to welfare?
Attitudes to welfare. See, yeah, this is something I need to think through more carefully. Maybe I used it a little too flippantly. It's just kind of from personal observation, being in Marrickville in particular, and the sort of narratives that the Greek community like to tell about the Hawke era, which is really, I think, when the Greek community kind of came into their own and were finally like, yes, we've achieved social mobility. We're the model ethnics now, the 1980s, that is. And Hawke did really love the Greek vote in particular, and he was quite popular in that part of Sydney. Why have I talked about it like a I don't. If you've spent any time in Marrickville and talked to any of the what are now aging elderly Greek populations there, then it's just palpable. I'm also thinking of the Addison Road Community Centre, which is where Vivi established her community childcare centre for multi-ethnic families. One of the halls that was donated, the Gumbramora Hall that opened up in Addison Road, opened up in 1988. It was a bicentenary project. It was opened up by Hawke. Many members of the community say that it was donated or gifted to the Greek community by Hawke, sort of as a not explicit, because I haven't found it written anywhere in any official documentation emanating from the government, as an apology for the social security scandal of the late 1970s.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm still trying to. Perhaps it doesn't even matter if it's true or not. Just the fact that the narrative circulates within the community is interesting. Yeah.
But that is so tightly held on to, and there's this very real fandom going on. Yeah. We have another question that relates to something that you mentioned quite briefly in your presentation today. So you talked about the large Greek community in Melbourne. And this question is just about, was there any specific networking that you've come across? Was there more success in Melbourne simply because of larger numbers? Was there a sharing of experiences between women across the two cities?
The only explicit example I found of this is direct connections between associations and networks between Sydney and Melbourne when it came to welfare work and women was through the Greek Welfare Workers Association, which was formed in Sydney by Vivi and Angela in 1978. And then later, a Melbourne branch was formed, and the Australian Greek Welfare Society did publish some of their responses to the social security scandal, some of their demands. So there was that kind of loose network. The reason I mean, Melbourne, yes, the numbers were there. There was a larger Greek population, but it was also kind of regional differences, more Greeks from the north of Greece who perhaps had been differently affected by the civil war, a higher proportion of left-wing kind of communist-aligned migrant groups erupted in Melbourne. The Greek Workers' Democratus League was quite active in Melbourne. That's not to say that the Atlas League in Sydney wasn't also quite active during this time. But when it came to welfare services in particular, the migrant rights movement and its concern with improving access and equity, much of those networks seem to cohere around a few key figures in Melbourne. It is a tricky one. I'm still trying to kind of map the explicit connections between these organisations in Sydney and those in Melbourne. It's difficult when a lot of it relies on kind of the personalities of particular people within these organisations. There is definitely a sense, and it's something that Frida argued as well, just from her personal observation, that there were more activists in Melbourne. And I think she might have meant perhaps more kind of communist-aligned activists rather than what was happening in Sydney, and particularly the kind of move to fund state-based agencies and to hire ethnic welfare workers to work within state-based agencies in New South Wales. That seemed to be more the pathway here. And again, I think that goes back to the fact that Welfare social services in Australia is historically has evolved on a state-based level rather than federally.
When we have time, I'm going to try and sneak in one more question because it's something that often people are really super interested in. You've obviously invested a phenomenal amount of labour into making it to this point. What is next for you and this research?
Yeah, okay. So I feel like that follows on from my previous answer because I am interested in mapping this network between Sydney and Melbourne. And I am actually this week heading to Melbourne to speak to a few more women who worked as welfare officers, welfare rights officers, social workers from the 1970s, particularly the women who were kind of tied into the Australian Greek Welfare Society. So the future of the project does involve hopefully a lot more oral histories and a deeper sense of how these women were engaged in these debates that change the way social work functions in this country, or doesn't, as it were, because as I indicated at the beginning, there's still many issues that seem so familiar, particularly around interpretation. Like if you look at recent reports coming out of the Australian Council of Social Services around the communication of COVID measures to ethnically and linguistically diverse communities, it could have been published in the 70s, you know. They're deeply structural issues that we're still kind of grappling with, and it is perhaps around cultural competency and maybe the Anglocentrism of a lot of these structures, but also just monolingualism and the need for kind of different ways of training social workers as well. Yeah.
Well, we have lots of comments, people very grateful for your presentation today and really interested in what you've discovered. A couple of people flagging that, yes, some things don't change, or at least don't change quickly enough for us. But it's great that there's so much work being done to keep that spotlight on what needs to improve. And some of the things, as you say, are structural, so that, you know, if we build it, we can rebuild it differently. But that is unfortunately all we have time for today. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along. It's been a great year of Scholar Talks. We will be back again next year. Our full season will be up online over the coming weeks. But just to pop in your diaries that on the 6th of February 2024 at 11 o'clock, Dr. Effie Karageorgios will be here and she will be sharing her work as a David Scott Mitchell Fellow and history of protest, and not necessarily all the mad flag-waving people that some of us remember from our early 20s, but all sorts of different types of protest groups, including people who protested things for the first time. So that promises to be a fabulous talk. Until then, I would like to thank my colleagues here at the State Library, Kathy Hammer and Lily Thomas, for helping me wrangle oral Scholar Talk text and online bookings that make it easy for people like you to come along and enjoy these talks. And of course, Daniela Baldry from Public Programs and Awards here at the Library, who is my ever-confident stage manager and always helping out behind the scenes. Thank you also for coming. The audiences are what makes this a great success, as of course do our fellows sharing their fabulous research into our collections. Stay safe, and I'll probably see you over Christmas and the New Year, but otherwise I'll see you in February. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.